such as we're going to have this evening, it only helps the greater of the population of all of us. So I always find that there's a key group in any type of volunteer endeavors that I'm engaged in. I find that there's a very key group of people who are instrumental in making change, and hopefully that's this group tonight. I'm confident that it is, because we need change. And we'll hear tonight, I am sure, from our esteemed speakers about all of the changes that have recently taken place in New York, and changes that are perhaps negatively taking place, or that have taken place, and what we can look forward to, hopefully on a positive basis for the future. So to introduce myself, I'm Joe Melizio. I'm the managing partner here at Vishnick McGovern Melizio. We're a full-service law firm, we like to say. We specialize in estate and trust work from the estate and trust planning perspective, administration, estate litigation, and various estate and trust planning mechanisms for business owners and things along those lines. I do general business work. My partner Joe Trotty in the back does family law and matrimonial work. And we also have a commercial litigation division. I started the LGBT practice about 15 years ago here at the firm, when LGBT people did not have any rights. So we were basically picking and choosing among various resources for how we could properly represent our clients who didn't have marriage rights, who didn't have a lot of parenting rights that we now have, although that's still evolving, who needed representation, and better yet, needed someone to stand up for them. And one of the things back then that Joe Trotty and Peter, who's one of our speakers tonight, did for the community was a documentary whereby they documented the Defense of Marriage Act and what it meant and what the negative consequences of it were. And it was produced and won a few awards with Saskia's help, who was with us at that time. And it made me so happy and proud that our firm could take such a great part in representing people and standing up for their rights and moving ahead with what people need, and that is to be like any other person. So I'm very pleased to say that due to people like Chuck, those rights have evolved for the LGBT community. And we still have a long way to go, but that's probably with respect to many groups. So here tonight, I am so pleased to introduce our speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what we can all work together on.
The big case.
So, it should only be. So this evening we have JoAnn Smith with us, we have Peter Carrozzo with us, and we have Chuck Lavine. I suppose you're Charles, but we all refer to him lovingly as Chuck. JoAnn is the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood of Nassau County, which provides quality, affordable health care and information to the people of Nassau County. PPNC is committed to serving all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, or ability to pay. JoAnn is also a passionate and fearless advocate for reproductive rights. In fact, for the last 12 years, JoAnn and her team have been at the forefront of fighting for so many of the progressive reforms that have just passed in the New York State Senate. In addition, JoAnn serves on the Board of Directors of the Health and Welfare Council of Nassau County and is a member of the Advisory Council of the Political Action Committee of Planned Parenthood Empire State Acts, the electoral arm of the Planned Parenthood affiliates of New York State. Welcome, JoAnn. Peter. Peter, our good friend, is an attorney who holds an LLM degree from New York University Law School with a concentration in legal history and legal scholarship, focusing on real property. Today, Peter serves as chief counsel at Cornerstone Legal Abstract in Belrose, which is a title insurance company. So if anybody's buying a house or refinancing a mortgage, you want to call Peter. But Peter's true passion and expertise is constitutional law, which he taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice for 12 years, and he has channeled that knowledge into his original website called Constitutionland, which attempts to bring the constitutional law to the people. Of note, Peter was an integral part in the making of our documentary, which I just described, which, by the way, is called Left Out in America, Legislating Love, Life, and LGBT. Thank you, Peter, wherever Peter is, for being with us. Hiding. Chuck Lavine represents the 13th Assembly District, which consists of portions of northeastern Nassau County. He serves as chair of the Committee on Election Law and is a member of the Committees on Codes, Ethics and Guidance, Rules, Insurance, and Judiciary. Chuck previously served as chair of the Committee on Ethics and Guidance, co-chair of the New York State Legislative Ethics Commission, and as a chair of the task force established to produce an Assembly Speaker's policy on sexual harassment, retaliation, and discrimination. Chuck is dedicated to fighting for legislation that will make New York an even better place to live. His passion is for a more transparent and efficient government, and has motivated him to author legislation that will strip corrupt public officials of their pensions. He is also a proponent of campaign finance reform and ethics legislation. Chuck is also a proud sponsor of legislation that resulted in the Marriage Equality Act in New York State. Of note, Chuck is married to Ronnie. Ronnie is a retired public school educator and is an active Planned Parenthood of Nassau County volunteer. So, welcome, Chuck. And I will invite our speakers to come up and give us some nice information.
We all work together?
Yeah, you can if you want.
Apparently so.
Then we can't see you.
Oh.
Oh,
yeah.
You're good.
I suppose whoever's gonna be doing the talking
Yeah.
will stand.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay,
All right?
I'll stay here until you're done.
How's
I
that?
wanna hear you.
Very
I
good.
wanna see you.
Yeah.
So I think you're first in
I
line.
can't.
I am first to speak, and I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here today to support Planned Parenthood. And I also want to thank my friend Joe Melizio, who is a champion of human rights and is a major contributor to the human rights campaign, which, like Planned Parenthood, fights for human rights. And if ever there was a time for us to fight for human rights, it is now. So my job is to go over some of the highlights of some of the recent laws that have been enacted in Albany. And those are the Reproductive Health Care Act, the Comprehensive Contraception Act, the so-called BOSS Bill, some of these you may not have heard of, GENDA, which demands gender equality, and a ban on...
Week of obsession or something like that?
It was fast and it was furious. And so let me go off script and just share something with you. There are 150 members of the New York State Assembly, and we could not do anything. There's people with economic expertise. They really, I hope nobody's recording this, but if they are, it's okay. They do all the work. So in the first 2 or 3 weeks, we passed so many important, major pieces of legislation that they were exhausted at that point, and now we went into the budget, which we just passed at the end of March. So these poor people, I hope, are somewhere sleeping, because many went without sleep at all. But on a very serious note, if it weren't for your commitment to change the New York State Senate, to make it a Senate that meets the obligations of the 21st century, we would still be nowhere. We would be here talking about what we hope to accomplish. So let me describe just very briefly some of the things we did accomplish. And from I'm going to deal with a little bit of history on the Reproductive Health Care Act. So New York was the second state after Hawaii to legalize abortion. This goes back to 1970, 3 years before Roe versus Wade. And what had occurred was, in the years following Roe versus Wade, there were additional protections that were afforded to women. Afforded isn't really the right word, and protections shouldn't be the right word either, because these are rights we are talking about. So our law lagged behind, and what the RHA did was to change the law so that now a woman can have an abortion within the first 24 weeks for any reason or the woman wants, and in the last trimester, a woman can have an abortion if her health or her life is in danger, or if the fetus is non-viable. That was not the law in New York State, and as a result of our laws lagging behind, doctors in New York State were at times afraid to perform abortions where they were necessary in the last trimester. So women at times had to go out of state. There were several cases of women who were bearing non-viable fetuses, and they had to leave New York State in order to be able to arrange to have abortions, because doctors here would not perform those abortions. So that is the heart of the Reproductive Health Care Act. There are some other provisions as well, but of importance is language in the actual statute that says that in the state of New York, a woman has this right. Not every state has that, and as you know, many states are rolling the clock back as quickly as they can. The amount of bills that have been submitted anti-woman's right to choose in the United States is up to about 500 or 600, and you know what's going on in many states with the fetal heartbeat laws. And so we are proud that in New York State we can stand for a woman's human right, and it's not just a woman's right. Anytime anyone's right is dissipated or lessened, everyone's right is lessened. So the Comprehensive Contraception Coverage Act requires insurance companies to pay for contraception. There are some other provisions as well, but it's a good thing, and it also mandates that insurance companies provide a year's supply of contraception for people who request it. And that's a good thing. The BOSS bill, something called the BOSS bill, is important because some of you remember what happened with Hobby Lobby and a Supreme Court, which was a better Supreme Court then than it is now. So employers in New York State are not allowed to intrude on the personal lives of their employees, and this is an essential safeguard for the privacy of our workers, and we will not allow employers to get involved in women, especially women, making the most important decisions and intimate decisions and meaningful decisions and difficult decisions at time of their lives. So a couple of other things that were recently enacted. The gender bill, gender non-discrimination. For years we fought to make sure that the human rights law of the state of New York prohibited anyone from discriminating against anyone because of their gender or their sexual identity, or and this went nowhere. The New York State Senate used to laugh at us for passing these bills. Well, thanks to you, those people who are laughing can stay home and laugh right now. there was something else called conversion therapy. And under this practice, so-called mental health professionals would essentially help in kidnapping people and talking to them and so-called providing therapy until they could change them and get them back to being red-blooded, strong heterosexuals. Well, we have outlawed that. Every scientist who has examined this practice has said this is not only wrong, this is destructive of the hearts and the souls of people. That ended. That would not have ended. Again, that was something that the New York State Senate used to laugh at us for passing. Additionally, there have been major changes to the election law, and as chairman of the election committee, New York State once again will be at the forefront of election rights. Election rights, the right to vote, is the most essential of all our rights because it is the right from which every other important right flows and emanates. So finally, New York's going to have early voting for 9 years. We will have no excuse absentee ballots. This may sound like a silly thing to you, and it was a silly thing, but we used to have separate primaries for federal and state elections. So every time, and there was absolutely no need for that, except that the Senate didn't want to have primaries in which they would have to worry they'd be in Albany in June and wouldn't be back to defend themselves. Generally speaking, recently from the Tea Party fanatics who were more fanatic than some of the people who were in the New York State Senate. So they may have had good reason. We will now do away with that. Our primaries will all be in June. So this accomplishes two good purposes. One, it allows for enough time for absentee ballots for the general election to be sent to our troops overseas and Americans. There are millions of Americans who are overseas who want to vote. And secondly, every time one of these elections occurs, it costs us, the taxpayers, it's at least 25 to approximately $40 million. So we were spending a ton of money for no good purpose because the Senate didn't want to do that, but you changed that. Now we've got a couple of other things that are going to happen. People will be able to register to vote on the same day. That won't occur for a couple of years because there's a constitutional referendum that has to be voted on. And we are allowing 16 and 17-year-olds now to pre-register, which means that when they're eligible to vote, they're automatically registered to vote. So these are good things. Finally, two final things. What does the future hold in store, especially in terms of human rights and reproductive rights? This is what it holds in store. Those of us in the state of New York are going to do everything we can to strengthen people in other states who are having their rights robbed right in front of their eyes. And we're going to do everything that we can do to make sure that people who live in those states are entitled to and receive the health care that they should receive. This is an important consideration, and you know why, you know what's going on nationally. Secondly, those of us who believe in reproductive rights and human rights are going to be doing everything we can to advance age-appropriate sex education starting in kindergarten so that our kids today can be as safe as can be and as well educated as can be. These are important things, even though we passed most of the bills that are critically important. Finally, let me just leave you with this quote by the great Ruth Ginsburg when she was at her Senate confirmation, and that's 26 years ago already. And these are her words: "It's essential to woman's equality with man that she be the decision maker, that her choice be controlling." This is what she told senators during her 4 days of questioning in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And, quote, "If you impose restraints that impede her choice, you are disadvantaging her because of her sex." We have our work cut out for us, but thanks to you, we have made some amazing progress, and working together, we will continue to make that progress. So I'm the one who thanks each of you.
So could I just ask you the education that you were talking about, that hasn't happened yet, that's in the future?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank
Peter.
you, Joe. So I'm gonna, that was, I can't believe how much that was accomplished. I'm just amazed that conversion therapy is something that exists in America.
Yes.
So, I know, so I'm going to speak about, explaining why New York State being this bastion of liberty is such an important thing, and specifically what I'm talking about is, federal rights versus state rights, and the importance of having state rights. So, in the United States, and this goes back from the beginnings of our Constitution, federal government can provide rights to its citizens, and of course, as you all probably know, when the Constitution was drafted, there was no Bill of Rights attached to it, and part of the way it got ratified was a promise to have a Bill of Rights added. But at the time, a lot of even very progressive people, if you'd say that in the 1780s, felt that a Bill of Rights would be a limiting effect and wouldn't be a good thing because it's up to the states to protect the rights of their citizens. And so the Bill of Rights was passed, and at certain times, even really the first 100 years of interpreting the Constitution, things like the First Amendment weren't really protected in any way by the federal government because the states themselves were to provide for those rights. The reason why I go back that far is just to explain in the 21st century why this is an important concept. So today, if New York wanted to give greater First Amendment right protection to its citizens, they can always give greater First Amendment protections, greater free speech protections than the federal government does. But what the First Amendment establishes and what federal rights, what federal protections like the Bill of Rights establish is a minimum of what rights have to be preserved or what rights have to be protected. So you can never give less rights than the First Amendment. You can never give less rights than the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. But you can always give more rights. So Chuck mentioned Hawaii before. Hawaii's always been an interesting state because when same-sex marriage wasn't even really an idea, there would be challenges. Men would go, and I think the first time was in Minnesota in 1971. Two men went to register to get a marriage license as a married couple, both being men, and was denied. And that case went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't hear it, but they denied the case. So Hawaii in the 1990s, these challenges would happen from time to time, but Hawaii in the 1990s had a challenge to it, and the Hawaii Supreme Court said that we're not going to interpret this by the watered-down 14th Amendment, we're going to interpret it by the Hawaii Equal Protection Clause. And the Hawaii Equal Protection Clause, just as a quick example, has it doesn't specify same-sex, but it specifies gender. And so gender was interpreted to mean both having the same gender. Now, Hawaii, even though everybody kept saying, I'm going to Hawaii to get married, same-sex couples, you heard this forever, and I would always hear this and I'd say, they're not getting married in Hawaii because it's not constitutionally protected in Hawaii, because that case actually lost because there was once the courts decided that was allowed, or that might be allowed, basically they came up with this thing called they interpreted something called strict scrutiny that says the state has to have a really good reason to deny same-sex marriage. While that case was going through the court system, the people of Hawaii had a referendum and said that marriage is defined as between a man and a woman, so that case didn't happen. So if you ever heard stories about people in the 90s getting married in Hawaii, they didn't get married in Hawaii. They just used it as an excuse to take a free vacation. And I used to argue with people all the time, and I finally stopped arguing.
Good work.
So I bring this up as an example because the Defense of Marriage Act is also a really good example of how rights were infringed upon, or how superior rights provided at the state level. So once states like Hawaii were discussing and debating the idea of same-sex marriage being protected, at that point not called marriage, of course, this was, even just 25 years ago, it was such a different time. The Defense of Marriage Act was passed, and then the federal government can say that no, it would allow that a state doesn't have to recognize an out-of-state marriage, which is it's something that never happened before in the history of the country, just because of the hatred of this concept of marriage being between two men and two women. But the states themselves did allow for these rights. Another example of how superior rights are being protected by the states. Now, not to belabor the point, but the reason why the Reproductive Health Act is so important is because if New York isn't this bastion of freedom for women's rights, or and also for transgender rights, then if something changed at the federal level, which we all know what direction that's going in,
you need places like New York, obviously. And then I just go back to what's going on with the courts, the federal courts. Everybody's focusing a lot on the Supreme Court of the United States right now. But at the district court level, so district court is a federal trial court level, and the circuit courts of appeals, which is the appellate court level, the number of judicial appointments that have taken place in the last 3 years, tremendous amount. And those are the people that will be potential Supreme Court candidates. Those are the people who are going to be writing opinions that a lot of times those opinions are the ones that become the law of the land. So in the Second Circuit, which covers New York and the surrounding states, if there's no Supreme Court decision that controls an issue that's decided by the circuit court, then the circuit court controls that opinion. So the circuit court decision is precedent as strong as the Supreme Court decision if the Supreme Court is silent on that. So that's really a threat, it could be a huge threat depending on how these decisions take place. So that's really just talking about what's going on at the court level, and obviously you all read about what's happening with this, what potentially could happen with the Supreme Court. I'm of the opinion, and a lot of other constitutional people are of the opinion, that as long as Chief Justice Roberts is the deciding vote, that Roe versus Wade is safe, because he's an institutionalist, which means that he believes in the institution of the Supreme Court. So if you have a precedent that's 45, 46 years old, like Roe versus Wade, Roberts understands that it would be a revolution that if he would allow it to be overturned. So I would bet, if I could bet money in Las Vegas on it, I would bet that that will not be overturned as long as he's the fifth deciding vote. Go ahead, sure.
No, just reading that his legacy, that he feels that if he wants to, once he leaves, that they want to look back and see what he accomplished or didn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't want that.
Yeah, I don't think he can. I mean, it's kind of like, I hate to go back to history, but there's a case called, the Dred Scott case, when they decided that slavery could, and that was Chief Justice Roger Taney's, the rest of his legacy. He actually did a lot of great things that are really boring for this crowd to hear about, for constitutional, for business law especially. But his legacy is Dred Scott. Roe versus Wade being overturned would be Chief Justice Roberts' legacy. But that doesn't mean that there can't be someone else who retires, or who God forbid, who's not there anymore, that could change things. So, yes.
So Roe is not overturned, but it can essentially be gutted.
Well, Roe, I mean, Roe, right, so after Roe, a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, of course, which you all would know about, became the, I guess, kind of like the barometer of abortion laws in the country, and that's when the undue burden test was established. So that just says that you can have burdens to having abortions. You could have barriers to having abortions, as long as they're not undue burdens or undue barriers. So if they're for the health of the woman, then those types of restrictions are allowed. So I always bring up Missouri, because to me Missouri is also like another barometer to what abortion rights are like in the country. So right now in Missouri, if you want to have an abortion, you have one place you can go to, and that's in St. Louis. So at times there'll be as many as 3 abortion clinics in Missouri. I think that was like the high water mark in the last 20 or 30 years. But by passing certain laws like that would gut abortion rights, you can prevent that. And what types of laws are those? Which you guys might already know just from having Planned Parenthood background. But if a doctor who performs abortions is required to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, or a hospital within 15 to 20 miles away, that's been able to close abortion clinics throughout the country. So to me, that's always a fascinating concept. So it's not going to be done as a big, in my opinion, it won't be done as a big, front cover of the New York Times type of decision. The real tragedy is that this is going on right now, and this has been going on with a much more liberal court than we have right now. And somehow it just happens, which is why Planned Parenthood is so important to raise awareness.
Where's Missouri now?
Missouri is just one abortion clinic, and they tried to get a waiver, I think, to on that law, but I don't know if it's finally been decided. But one other really interesting thing that's going on is the fear of what could happen if Roe versus Wade were overturned, or Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And there have been 6 states that have passed trigger acts, which again, probably stuff that a lot of folks know from Planned Parenthood. But just to tell you briefly, a trigger law says that if the Supreme Court ever overturns the right to abortion, that abortion will be illegal in the state. And 6 states right now have it, and 8 have it proposed, and supposedly a lot of traction. So it could very easily be 14 very quickly. And the laws are straight out outlawing abortion. So there's no, even the protections that they discussed in the 70s and the 60s about, you know, in the case of rape or health of the mother, these would be completely gutted. But this would be like the Middle Ages, you know.
Could it ever be made illegal to cross state lines in order to get an abortion?
That's a really good question. Because there's no way to limit people's rights to travel, and there's no contraband being traveled with. I don't believe it could be, because you have the free right to go to any place, and they can't really determine intent. But it's not a situation like fireworks or like contraceptives, because at one time contraceptives were illegal in the country also. And actually traveling with contraceptives were, also another famous Planned Parenthood case, Estelle Griswold, yeah. You have a picture of her in the wall, I think, somewhere or something.
Have you seen Saskia's pocketbook? She would be
It's not Estelle.
arrested in every state.
Yeah, fireworks and condoms. So I'll you know, leave it at that, and if there's any questions, I think we'll do questions and answers later. So.
JoAnn,
Shall I?
please.
Thank you.
Well, I am so thrilled to be here tonight, and thank you so much, Joe, for hosting us, and thank you, Peter, for, where'd you go, Peter? Oh, there you go. For being my partner again. Peter joined us at our Roe celebration in January and talked wonderfully about constitutional law, which is absolutely fascinating. So I'm JoAnn Smith. I'm the president of Planned Parenthood of Nassau County, and I'm so thrilled that you're all here tonight, and I thank you, because you are, as Joe said and Peter said, you are the reasons, and Chuck said, you are the reasons that we now have protections in New York State that we didn't have before, that we enjoy those, and it's mandatory, because what happened on January 22nd, which was the anniversary of Roe, is that we made sure that abortion was truly legal in New York State and therefore safe, because that's the whole issue. If it's not legal, it's not safe. Women died before Roe v. Wade was passed. In 1973, that's when Roe was adjudicated, as you know, and Sarah Weddington, who was the 25-year-old lawyer who argued the case, said years later, I had the privilege of meeting her, and so did you, Sarah. And by the way, I just want to say my wonderful staff, Planned Parenthood staff, can you just stand up because they, and thank you for for arranging this and making it happen. And our wonderful board members, could you stand up too? Board members. So Sarah Weddington said that when Roe was passed, she said, the collective we, thought that it was written in sandstone, or rather in stone, and that indeed it had been written in sandstone, and it had been chipped away, year by year, case by case over the years, and here we are today. So it was an absolutely amazing day in Albany on January 22nd, when we truly did celebrate the fact that New York is really the beacon of reproductive freedom that we have always wanted it to be and has been for the people who live here, and that it is now a safe haven for those who do not. So our goals over the next year is to ensure that New York remains that safe haven and becomes a sanctuary state, because as Peter said, and as that state by state by state, they can pretty much do anything they want. They can't, Roe is the law of the land, but they can put up all kinds of barriers to having an abortion. And I want to go back and talk about abortion for just one more second, because the reason that sex ed is so important, that Chuck brought up. is that we could have the best sex ed in the world, allowing that in every grade, in every school in this country, that people would learn about sex ed and what their bodies were doing and how to make sure that they stayed safe and healthy. Wouldn't that be a miracle? And if we also had universal health care. I'm not going down that road, but if we did, which I would love, because at Planned Parenthood we believe that health care is a right and it's not a privilege. Yes, right. People should have the health care that they need, not just what they can afford. But anyway, if all those things were in place, if we had universal health care and we had universal sex ed, there would still be a need for abortion. Things happen during pregnancies. There are always accidents. Things happen. So it's a hotbed issue, which quite frankly many as you know, Chuck, so well, the true politicians don't care about it. It just becomes a wedge issue that allows for votes, and it's been something that people have glommed onto with the conservative right over the years. And quite frankly, we are living the vision of the conservative right that began in the 70s, in the early 70s. So we are living their legacy, and they did a good job, but we are doing an even better one, which is why you're so important. So you all read the news about the heartbeat bill that now in 8 states has passed. Some have been already deemed illegal, but they are hoping for that one conservative district, federal district court, that will rule that it's indeed legal, and therefore these decisions about abortion rights will percolate up to the Supreme Court. I hope that what you said is accurate, Peter.
I could be wrong.
Well, no. You said you'd go to Las Vegas with me.
Yeah. I've lost money before.
No. I want to know you're a winner. You're a winner. But I'm counting on that bet, because we have the fact that these states are saying that at the basically it would outlaw abortions for everyone at 6 weeks. Women don't even know that they're pregnant at 6 weeks. Ronnie is one of our counselors. Ronnie talks with people who come in for all issues, what kind of birth control they want, if they need testing for HIV or sexually transmitted infections, and indeed if they want to terminate a pregnancy. And Ronnie gives them all of their options, and she says, you have options. You have options, and you can decide to bring the pregnancy to term and put your baby up for adoption, and we will facilitate that, help facilitate it. And you can decide to become a parent, bring the pregnancy to term and become a parent, or indeed you can decide to terminate the pregnancy. And that is something that needs to always be legal and therefore safe. So what is happening with this heartbeat bill is just outlawing abortions, all abortions, and one state after another is doing it because they're making a stand, and they are saying this can be done. And now I make fun of it, but it's actually true. So many of the states that are involved in these heartbeat bills have either their names either begin or end with a vowel. Beware of vowel states. That's all it's Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. It just goes on and on and on. And there are other bills that are in the pipeline, other heartbeat bills that have not been passed as yet in about 11 other states. There is this, it's a wedge issue to get people divided. And that's where we all come in, and standing together. And you have stood with Planned Parenthood for how many years? We have Lottie, who is also one of our counselors, and a wonderful addition to our family. And we have, Betsy's been on our board for how many years? Yeah, forever, right? You started as a volunteer way back when you were
1980 about?
Yes, when you were, a young,
When I was
a young bride. So each one of you has stood with us for all these years, and we need you to continue to stand with us. what's happening right now also is, the Trump administration, I hate even saying that word. I hate it. And,